Welcome to what is the third and final part of my presentation, which you'll find on this YouTube channel, called Where Shakespeare is Really Buried. And I hope you've seen parts 1 and parts 2. This won't make quite so much sense if you haven't. If you have, you will remember that in part 1 I showed, in fact I proved, if you were mathematically inclined, you would say that I proved, that Edward de Vere was buried directly beneath this statue to William Shakespeare, set up in 1740, an important date, in Westminster Abbey. You'll remember also that de Vere Shakespeare is identified by the numbers 1740, and you will also be aware, if you've seen part 1, that I have shown, and again I would say if you're a mathematician, I have proven that Edward de Vere was the author of Shakespeare's sonnets, as it is repeated 3 times, the message, these sonnets by God and de Vere, meaning these sonnets by de Vere and the grace of God that is within him. And we saw that 3 times. I'm going to show you a rather startling new revelation this time, and I'm also going to take you through a little bit of the history of that discovery, which I think will give some further insight and some more depth into what it's all about and what it really means. Lastly, you will remember, of course, that I suggested, and you can see here that Shakespeare is pointing at the word temples, and the first folio is dedicated to temples, and I suggested that the people who put this monument up to William Shakespeare knew damn well that they were putting it on top of the remains of Edward de Vere, and that they were some form of proto-Masonic group identifying themselves with Templary. It's always dangerous to give these people names. Knights Templar makes people guffaw with laughter. Rosicrucians makes people sneer. It doesn't really matter what the group was calling itself. It was a secret group. Its ends were to get closer to God, ultimately to surrender their will to God through knowledge. And by understanding the world, they got closer to God, and their idea was that the world was created by God using letters and numbers and geometry, and study, therefore, and knowledge was all important. Okay, well, I got into this, as I stated in the first presentation, when a fellow called Alan Green, a musician from Southern California, downloaded onto the YouTube a startling, very startling video that showed that behind this cover, this title page, was a hidden geometry. He actually went quite a lot further than what I'm showing you here and joined up endless amounts of dots and lines, and a lot of what he's done is controversial. I think it's probably correct, actually, but people have argued with it. The bit I'm showing you now is unarguable, it's incontestable, and it was a great sense of excitement when I first saw this, because so much about Shakespeare and the Shakespeare authorship relies on hidden, covert, cryptic evidence which people can argue about. This is certainly covert, this is certainly cryptic, it's hidden, but you can't argue with it. It's absolutely watertight. Mathematically, in terms of geometry, there is a hidden circle on this title page. I wasn't sure when I first saw it what to make of it, but obviously the great big G down in the bottom left-hand corner there and the hidden circle made it very, very obvious that Masons were involved. Masons, of course, are obsessed with capital G's, one of their main insignia, and with hidden geometry. But when I first saw it, I really wasn't aware whether it meant that simply that the printers of this book were Masons. It could have meant no more than that. But I did keep studying, and I took out my Baconian books because, as some of you will know, those who believed that Bacon was Shakespeare were very keen on Shakespeare being a Mason, and I tended in the past to skip those passages about the Masonic. It was so full of symbolism and difficulty, and I thought it was belaboured a bit and boring. But of course, having seen this, I went racing back to all those books and about Shakespeare and Masonry. One of the other things I did is I started scribbling on this title page myself, and very quickly came up with this, which is the Cairo symbol, you'll remember, and I put a symbol of Christ, and I posted it onto an Oxfordian forum and was surprised how little interest it garnered. Of course, at that stage, I didn't realise how very, very important it was in answering the authorship question, and of course in locating the exact spot where Edward de Vere was buried. This is the dedication page, as you probably all know, and a lot of Oxfordians in the past have had a go at this, trying to make sense of it. 3 triangles. It's been observed by a scholar called Dorner Bewley that they might represent the 624, the death date of Edward de Vere, June the 24th. The most famous Oxfordian scholar who really kicked off all of this was John Rollet, the late Dr. John Rollet, a friend of mine, very clever man, very nice man, a scientist actually by trade. He was the person who said, look, these 3 triangles are 6 to 4 lines in length, respectively, and if you count the words demarcated by the dots and hyphens, you get the message these sonnets by ever the 4th. Now, Dr. Rollet was a man of great integrity, and although he could see quite obviously how exciting this was to Oxfordians, these sonnets all by ever, Vere, or Vere, he actually repudiated it because he didn't think there was any sense in the 4th. In other places where he found something, he said, I think this is probably part of something bigger, but in this particular one, he just stood away from it and said, we can't really accept it. He gave another reason, which I think is slightly silly, for not accepting it. He said there's no verb in the sentence. These sonnets, all by ever, he wanted all written by. Actually, I think that I say that's a silly reason, and I do think it is. When you see a book title, it says Great Expectations by Charles Dickens or Othello by Shakespeare. You don't have to say written by, composed by. It's quite an unnecessary excuse. But maybe to say that ever the 4th didn't mean anything is fair enough. Anyway, he stood back from it. It didn't, of course, stop other Oxfordians who were excited by it continuing to examine it. Most notable, perhaps, is Catherine Sharp, who said, well, why did John Rollet stop at ever the 4th? If you carry on the sequence 624, 624, 62, you would actually end up with that bottom T. These sonnets by ever the 4th T, she suggested. She wasn't quite sure what T meant, but she thought maybe the 4th T on the page is the T, second T in begetter, and so maybe it's a hint that the word is begetter. These sonnets all by Vere, the begetter, i.e. the author of the sonnets. She was quickly answered, this is back in 2006, 2007, by an American professor, Charles Herberger, who said, well, actually, why are you ignoring those hyphens? In fact, if you just do the dots and still count the 624 sequence, you get these sonnets all by ever-living, well-wishing T. Now, Professor Herberger also didn't quite know what to make of T, but he made an educated guess. He said maybe it's to do with time. And another American scholar, Arthur Neuendorfer, looked at this, and we'll come up with how he did it, but he made a conscious effort to work out what T meant and was obviously much closer, and I'm going to talk about that. But one of the things he said T could mean is God. He connected it to the triple tau, and he also, with ever the 4th T, he suggested the upside down cross of St. Peter, something which I no longer believe is true, but it doesn't matter. It was interesting work he was doing. And finally, Alan Green, the fellow I showed who came up with that hidden geometry, he said, well, actually, Catherine Sharp and Charles Herberger's 2 different versions could be intentional, that both of them are correct. He too was following Neuendorfer and suggesting that God is one of the meanings of T. And so he said you can say these sonnets all by ever the 4th T, and equally these sonnets by ever-living, well-wishing T, that both the messages were intended. As far as I'm aware, the importance of 3 times 3 was not really shown by any of these scholars in the sense of it being the whole key to the whole encryption, which of course it is. But it raises some questions. Those of you who have seen part 1 will know that I am saying that everything is validated by 3 times 3, by repeating a message 3 times, or by having some little symbol of Christ, such as a T or whatever it is, 3 times around any part of the encryption, and that gives it its validation. Of course, it brings up a certain interesting question. If 3 times 3 and the triple tau, which you see there at the bottom, the very important Masonic symbol, if, as I'm saying, the 3 triangles are a simulacrum, a representation of the triple tau, and therefore a key to the whole thing, then we have to ask ourselves, if 3 times 3 is so important, why on earth is the dedication set in 12 lines? 3 times 3, as we all know, is 9, and if 3 times 3 is so vital, you would expect 9 lines, not 12. Quite interesting, those of you who know Shakespeare's Love's Labour's Lost well, you'll remember when Barone says 3 times 3 is 9, and Costard, the cunning clown, answers, "Not so, sir. We know what we know." What does he mean by that? You'll remember how I showed you that the capital I, or the iota, is a symbol of Christ. Jesus, the first letter of Christ. Actually, you can take 3 symbols of Christ to form these upside-down triangles. If I is one of them, the capital T, the Tau cross, the sign of Christ, and of course the V, ego sum via veritas et vita, I am the truth, the life, and the way. If you put the V and the T and these I's together, then you have your upside-down triangle composed of 4 lines each. Of course, 4 lines is 12, so you've got your 3 upside-down triangles in 12 lines, which is exactly what we seem to have on the dedication. So what we're looking at here, if we're looking at this profoundly, is not so much 3 times 3, but it's 3 times 3 with the hidden 4th element. People say the Trinity. The Trinity is often argued. It's called the Trinity. It's 3 parts. It's God the Father, God the Son, i.e. the Son of God, and God the Holy Ghost. But where does that leave Jesus, the Son of Man, with his free will, the I, capital I, that being that 4th part of the Trinity? Okay, these 3 triangles in this formation, upside-down triangles, you'll find on the aprons of a degree of Freemasonry called Holy Royal Arch. Holy Royal Arch has the principal insignia of the triple tau, those 3 T's. And part of the ritual, it's in a triangle there. Often, not always, but the Royal Arch display the triple tau within a triangle. Part of the ritual responses in Royal Arch Freemasonry are these. The High Priest says, "Are you a Royal Arch Mason?" And the respondent says, "I am that I am." You'll remember Shakespeare in Sonnet 121, "I am that I am," and the letter that Edward de Vere writes to his father-in-law, "I am that I am." Of course, this is considered by some slightly blasphemous. "I am that I am" is the name of God. But of course what they're saying is, I am that I am, I have my own free will, but I do what I do by the grace of God that is within me. I am, in a sense, the 4th part of the Trinity. We're coming back to this. Also the High Priest in Royal Arch Freemasonry, he says, "How shall I know you to be a Royal Arch Mason?" And the respondent has to say, "By 3 times 3. So we begin to see that the Royal Arch Masons are very exercised by this 3 times 3. When was the Royal Arch Masonry founded? Well, the first we ever hear about it is in, yes, 1740. It's that date again. The main Freemasons sort of came out of their closet, as it were, or stopped being secret in 1717. That is also a very significant year, not by accident. When the Royal Arch Freemasons appeared, they said, "Okay, Masons, you think that there are 3 degrees of Masonry, but there aren't. Actually, there's 4 degrees of Masonry, have been all along. Royal Arch Masonry," they said, "is the root, heart, and marrow of ancient Masonry." And it's the 4th part that you didn't seem to know about. And there are, in fact, 4 degrees to Masonry. Okay, all of this, or a lot of this, has excited the interest of Shakespearean scholars, who, since about the mid-19th century, have been very interested in the idea that Shakespeare was a Freemason. All this culminated, actually, in the early part of the 20th century in a book written by a man called Alfred Dodd. And the full title of that book is Shakespeare, Creator of Freemasonry, being a remarkable examination of the plays and poems which proves incontestably that these works were saturated in Masonry, that Shakespeare was a Freemason and founder of the fraternity. Alfred Dodd went on to say that Shakespeare was the sole creator of Royal Arch Freemasonry. Now, Alfred Dodd was, of course, a Baconian, that is, someone who believes that the works of Shakespeare were written by Francis Bacon, which is now disproved, but it's not so disproved that we need to mock and scorn the Baconians. They had a lot of extremely interesting things to say. Bacon was Edward de Vere's cousin, and it is very possible that if de Vere was the master or the head of this proto-Masonic group, that Bacon took it over after his death, and that Bacon therefore does have quite a considerable part to play in the publication of the first folio, etc. So what were the Baconians saying about Bacon and Royal Arch Freemasonry? Well, Bacon wrote a work called Abecedarium Naturae, which means the ABC of nature, and it's said to be a fragment, although Baconians argue that it's not a fragment. It's very deliberately written as it's written. And they ask themselves a simple question. If it's an ABC, it should start with A and go on to B and then C. Why does Bacon begin this work with triplex tau? Triple tau, that's no way to begin an ABC. The triple tau, which he associates with the number hexagesima septima, that's 67, and with terra, earth. Well, we know that in Greek, earth is gay, that great capital G. We know the connections between earth, geometry, measuring of the earth, and Freemasonry. Triple tau is curious, and the Baconians wanted to say, why on earth does Bacon place such an importance on triple tau, and why does he link it to the number 67? If you look at the Greek alphabet and you allot each letter a number in what's known as simple gematria, you see that alpha equals 1, beta is 2, gamma is 3, etc., until tau, which is number 19. Now, if tau is 19, then 3 taus, triple tau, should be 3 times 19, which is 57. But Bacon says it's 67. The method he's using is he goes on beyond the last letter, number 24, omega, and then starts all over again. Double alpha, double beta, double gamma, renumbering those, 25, 26, and so on, all the way until he gets to triple tau, by that method, is 67. So the Baconians say, why? Why is he doing it this way? Now, I've explained simple gematria to you. That's A equals 1, B equals 2, C equals 3, D equals 4, etc., etc., etc. If you allot each letter a number, then you find that the name Francis comes to 67. So what the Baconians were arguing was that Francis Bacon was associating himself very closely with the triple tau by allotting it 67, which is Francis, and that helped them to think, well, maybe he was the head of the Royal Arch Freemasons, which at that time were undercover, possibly calling themselves Rosicrucians, possibly calling themselves Templars in some way, we don't know. Where, if this is correct, does this leave Edward de Vere, who we now know was the writer of Shakespeare's works? Well, interestingly enough, you'll see in my part 1 of this presentation how many times we've associated Edward de Vere Shakespeare with the number 1740, and I'm going to show you some more times in a minute. It's really indisputable that this is what he is doing. 17 plus 40, of course, is 57. Remember, the tau is 19, 3 19s are 57, so it looked very much like Edward de Vere is also associating himself with the triple tau. Now, you will remember if you look in the little grid, this is just a highlight grid on the right of laying out the whole of the sonnet's dedication into a grid of 19 letters. I've just taken a little chunk out of it. You remember the message that Rollet and Catherine Sharp found, these sonnets all by ever the fourth T, and how this upside down T, which was discovered by Arthur Neuendorfer, has De Vere written in it and is set just beside the triple tau, which gave Arthur Neuendorfer the idea that there was a connection between that message in the sonnets, these sonnets all by ever the fourth T, and this upside down T with De Vere written in it, because it was so near to those three T's and therefore it seemed to be like a fourth T. He suggested, quite rightly, trying to find some reason, that this fourth T was the fourth cross, the upside down cross of St. Peter. This is something I put into the presentation. Actually, I don't believe it's correct anymore. I'm not saying anything wrong with the idea. It makes a sensible narrative, and Neuendorfer is absolutely correct to say that early Christians did see the triple tau as a symbol of the three crosses at Calvary. But the triple tau is a lot more than that, and what I'm saying now is that the upside down T as representing De Vere as the fourth T has nothing to do with the fourth cross and St. Peter. If you look at that triple tau in the middle of the page, yes, it's called a triple tau for an obvious reason. It consists of three T's. There's one on the left there, there's one at the top, and there's one on the right. It also consists of a hidden fourth T, which, like that De Vere fourth T, is upside down, and it is right there in the very center. So we have this interesting situation again of a trinity that in fact contains a hidden fourth part. Now, I said, did I not, that the dedication, these three triangles of the dedication, are a simulacrum of the triple tau, the key. If I'm right about that, then it shouldn't just be 3 times 3, because we now know that the triple tau consists of an upside down fourth T, that is De Vere. So if I'm right that the three triangles in the dedication are a simulacrum of the triple tau, then we should be able to find that fourth T that is De Vere. If you look closely at the first of the upside down triangles, you'll notice that 2 of its lines are symmetrical. Line 1 has 12 characters to the left and 12 characters to the right of a central dot. And line 6 has 1 character to the left and 1 character to the right of a central Y. Now, remember that Y is a very interesting letter because in modern English and before, it is a thorn, that is to say a TH. Ye olde bookshop, ye olde pub. You often see ye actually means the, and it represents a TH. Now, if you look very closely at the triple tau symbol, yes, it's 3 T's, but it can also be seen as a TH, a capital T sitting on top of a capital H. Now, if that little y represents a triple tau, 3 T's, let us count 6 lines from the bottom, 6 lines from the top. We find that we have a very central line there, our ever-living poet, which is, as you can see by joining that central dot on the Y, an upside down T. Just above the Y's, you've got your 3 T's and you've got your fourth T. As we know, these sonnets are by ever the fourth T. If you take the 2 people who are named here, i.e. our ever-living poet and Mr. WH, and count those 2 people as one word, one label if you like, and you count the words in that upside down triangle at the top, you'll find there are 16. So yes, our ever-living poet is the 17th. So we have 1740 again. And this isn't the only time we're going to see this. If you count the T's on that page, there are 19 of them in all, including the the so-called signature initials, double T at the bottom. So the 17th T on the page is this one right there. That's the 17th T, and what have we got just before it? 40. So we have, once again, 1740. Now we know that 1740 is the Earl of Oxford's Edward de Vere, and we know that he's the upside down T relative to the triple tau, the three T's. So where are the three T's relative to that 1740, the fourth T? Yes, they're just above, beautifully set there in an almost perfect triangle. T, 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 with the fourth T at the bottom. Again, the upside down T that is contained in the triple tau that we are identifying with de Vere. These sonnets all by ever the fourth T. So there it is again. And set, in this case, as a triangle, just as you see in the Royal Arch Freemasonry, the triple tau in a triangle. Okay, so we've now seen how Edward de Vere again associates himself with the fourth T, and how the fourth T is this upside down T that forms part of this utterly important godly symbol, the triple tau. If you pull that fourth T down out of the triple tau like that, so you see you've got the triple tau at the top and the fourth T brought down, you have something called a cross potent, a 4T cross. And it was in reference to that, of course, that I found on the right, sorry, I'm jumping ahead of myself, on the right you see the fourth T cross there, which is the insignia of the Master of the Royal Secret in, yes, you guessed it, Royal Arch Freemasonry. And it was because of that that I drew the cross potent onto the encryption there and found that all-important message, heed Vere's paternity lie, which helped me to move to the right and find the other symbols to show what the sonnets are about. If you haven't seen that, that's in part 2 of this presentation, part 2 of Where's Shakespeare Really Buried. Okay, so if you've seen part 1, you'll remember this. This is the dedication of the sonnets laid out in the 19th letter grid. It was here that we found the triple tau. I say we found it, actually it was Arthur Neuenberger who found it. I was incorrectly told by Alan Green that this is the only grid that has a perpendicular triple tau like that. I'm not going to castigate him for that, because in fact it turned out to be like the invention of penicillin. It was an extremely useful blunder, because by thinking that he was right and assuming there was no other grid with three T's on it, I relentlessly stuck to this grid and decided that everything that was needed to be found could be found on it. And that turned out to be correct. So it was a very fortuitous error. Interesting that this triple T should be found in column 12. As you will remember, we had a look at the beginning that 3 3s are 9, it should be in column 9, and 12 is telling us something. Maybe there's something hidden there. Yes, well, there is actually, and of course the fourth T, it's Vere, making the fourth T, and 3 4s are 12, which is why it's in column 12, and of course why we saw that the 3 triangles of the dedication were set in 12 lines, not 9. As I said, it was Arthur Neuendorfer who found this. What he didn't see, and nor did Alan Green, and I don't want to in any sense take them down for this, because my word, I've been looking at things, sometimes they just stare you in the face and you don't see them. And when I looked at this, that was the most obvious thing almost, the word fourth. How that fourth T is sitting right on top of that word fourth, and how the word fourth actually connects to the 3 T's. So if anything, this helped me in my own mind to endorse Neuendorfer's view that this triple T was connected to the 3 tau. Sorry, the upside down T was connected to the triple tau. Another thing that they hadn't seen, but I saw again straight away, not claiming any superiority, it was obvious to me. I suspect from all the hours and hours and hours of my languid and recalcitrant youth spent in Latin Mass, the ISH in signo hoc, or in hoc signo, which once again very much endorses the fact that this is correct, and I knew also in hoc signo vinces, that VIN there seemed, at least to me, straight away to prove that the ISH was intentional, and so everything was pointing at this triple tau, and it's a very important symbol. I'm going to just go backwards for a second. This is the Shakespeare, supposedly the Shakespeare gravestone at Stratford-upon-Avon. We now know that nobody's actually buried underneath it, and it's a bit of a joke. Alan Green did some interesting work on this, following on from Neuendorfer's ideas of looking at things in patterns, such as a T rather than in straight lines, and he did some great work on the 17th grid, that is to say, laying out this text in a grid of 17 cells across. How you get to 17, Green didn't seem very sure, and gave what I think a slightly silly reason, such as Henry Rothelsey was 17 in 1590. It got nothing to do with anything really. If you want to get to 17, and if 17 is correct, and I think it is, you have to find internal reasons to go for 17. David Roper has found a few, I think. There's one quite obvious one actually staring us here, the capital I of Jesus. I, of course, is 1, so if you count that as 1 and count each letter, you come to 17 letters. That's probably one of the clues about why you should be on the 17th grid. Anyway, never mind how Green got there. He did find some very interesting things, and I just want to show you a little bit of that. Well, firstly, of course, the triple tau. There it is in column 10, and right next to it, Green saw this, which again looks a bit like a stubby upside down T with the letters Vere's, an anagram of Vere's in it. Actually, what Green should have been looking at is this. It's very important that he looks at that. The position of that T is absolutely vital to some other research that he's doing. But quite apart from anything, you're being told to look at it that way. NB, nota bene. Nota bene was coming into fashion, particularly as an initial NB, brought into fashion by none other than John Dee, the cryptographer, conjurer, general genius of Queen Elizabeth's court, and as Green shows, this encryption appears to be signed not once but twice by John Dee. So let me just put that to the side for a second and compare it with the encryption that we've found on the dedications, which is rather an astonishing set of coincidences, I think. So on Shakespeare's grave in Stratford, we see nota bene. This is Green and with my emendations. Nota bene Vere's T. Note well, Vere's T. Set to the left there of the triple tau, both set as an upside down T of 6 squares, and both signed. We'll come to that. In this sign, De Vere and John Dee signing there, John Dee signing there. I think the coincidence of those two, given that they are both extremely important and obviously cryptic statements relating to William Shakespeare, is too much for any sensible brain to dismiss as mere coincidence. On the grave encryption, the 17th equal letter spacing, Alan Green goes on to find a lot of interesting things, and he uses the Neuendorfer idea of looking for messages in T's and different shapes, and it was this technique that entirely guided me when I was looking at this grid. One of the problems I had, of course, I didn't really know what I was looking for. I'd found that fourth, I'd found the ISH, and I was sitting gawping at this when my daughter, Mary Waugh, clever clogs, was walking behind me with a cup of tea and just cast her eye over what I was looking at, and as she moved on said, "Lies here." I said, "What?" She said, "Lies here." Lies here. And this was an absolutely brilliant revelation. Very, very brilliant and highly useful, and was the catalyst for everything I found, because At last I realised that there was a message not only set in a beautiful capital I, of which I later found there were three, but I at last knew what I was looking for. And not only did I know what I was looking for, I knew exactly where to look for it, because I had ISH 3 times, and so I knew above those 2 ISHs I would find where he was buried, and I couldn't have been better placed to know where he was buried, because 2 years earlier I had already published an article saying that the Stratford monument, the epitaph on the monument, tells you that he is buried, Shakespeare is buried, in Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey. If you haven't seen that, I give a slightly fuller version of it, uploaded onto this YouTube channel, and it's called Monkey Business at Stratford-upon-Avon. So I advise you to see that if you haven't, and it shows how the monument tells you he's buried in Poets' Corner. So I knew he's in Poets' Corner, I knew where to find it above these ISH signs, and it really didn't take me that long to find South Cross Isle of St. Peter's in that symbol. Here, of course, the upside down cross does mean St. Peter's. It's very clearly an upside down a Petrine cross, but that has nothing to do with these sonnets by Ever the Fourth T, as I'm saying. The fourth T is something else. And then I found that quite quickly, and then found this, the Westminster, beautifully done in the shape of Westminster Abbey, the ground plan of Westminster Abbey. So we had the message to the Westminster at South Cross Isle, St. Peter's, Edward de Vere lies here. Well, I tell you, I was extremely exhilarated when I found this, but I also was aware I hadn't actually made much progress. I knew already that he was buried in Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey, because you're told that by the monument at Stratford-upon-Avon. I was very interested looking at this, and also to see the ground plan and to see that the 3 T's in Westminster Abbey, the middle one, Veritas, is situated in Poets' Corner. That's where he's buried. And of course then the idea came to me, looking at that ground plan, that there must be, with such a sophisticated encryption as this, we must be told the exact spot where he's buried. It would be highly unlikely that all this trouble would have gone just to say he's buried in an area of 82 foot by 60 foot. And that's what drew me back to Alan Green's Hidden Geometry. And I quickly realised that the 4th T on the page was the one that was captioning this dot, and was interested also to see that on Alan Green's video, where he joined pretty well every dot in sight, he didn't seem to be paying any attention to this particular dot, and it obviously had a purpose. I won't go through all of it. You've seen this in the presentation, how I overlap that onto a map of the South Cross Isle, and it reveals the exact spot where Shakespeare's buried, and it's right underneath the Shakespeare monument. The other great excitement for me, of course, was when I looked at what the monument was actually saying, and again, straight away saw those 4 T's and knew that they were highly significant, and that the dropping of the E of Towers allowed for 1740. This sent me driving back, actually, to other places where other Oxfordian scholars had associated Oxford with the number 40, to see if actually what we weren't really looking at was 1740. So, for instance, where Alan Green cleverly saw O dies, 4 O's dies, right at the end of Hamlet, and associated that as 40 dies, I quickly realised that in fact the rest is silence dot is 17 characters, and we've actually got 1740 dies. And likewise, where Green looks at page 40 of the history plays, a great moment where Richard II is giving away all of his identity as a king, and he sees the connection between 40 there, and I found there are actually 1740s there. So 1740 really is the sort of key to everything. Right, this is the last part I want to talk about, because I did label this presentation, Where is Shakespeare Really Buried? And of course anyone who's concentrated on it and has looked it through will notice that there is another matter of huge significance that is proven in Where He's Really Buried, and a lot will say it's much more important than Where He's Really Buried, and that's who actually wrote Shakespeare. And we see 3 times the message that they're by God and de Vere. So on the front page here, they're by G, that big capital G is God, in the bottom left, and De Vere around the sign of Christ, pointing to that. Now, I obviously realised that this was a very important evidence of the message, Shakespeare's sonnets by God and De Vere, but I also realised that to validate this, I had to find that message 3 times, or I couldn't expect other people to believe in it. The whole key to the whole thing was 3 times 3. We had to have this message 3 times 3, and it's quite a complicated message. These sonnets are by God and De Vere, so is it likely we'd find them? Well, actually, as I said, this amalgam of interesting work by 5 Oxfordian scholars had given me a second shot at it. We had these sonnets all by Ever, the 4th T, and read without the hyphens, these sonnets by ever-living, well-wishing, that's benevolent T, which is God. So just by switching on and off the hyphens, essentially, we had these sonnets by God and De Vere. I still had to find a third one, and this was vexing to me. I actually took all my clobber on holiday to Menorca, where summer of 2017 was extremely hot, and I spent most of my time in a concrete room, was the only cool place, on my bed, just staring at all the evidence and trying to find the 4th time that God and De Vere. Again, I was talking about how Neuendorfer and Alan Green failed to see the word 4th, which to me was very obvious. Well, I was staring at something hugely obvious, but not seeing it. I was going around in circles looking at the 17th T there, 1740, on the dedication, and I was looking very hard at this 4T that sits in the middle of that line of 17 letters, 1740. I thought it's got to be somewhere there. And I knew it would exist, this the third iteration of it. As I was staring at this bottom of this page, and I remembered how the brilliant actor and friend Mark Rylance, when I showed him how this was about Oxford, and he said, oh yes, he said, look at that T, look how it's actually printed to look like an ox, whereas the T next to it is in the same swash font as the G. And then I thought to myself, of course, I've already got there. I already knew that D for T meant Oxford, and I know that that line is 17 letters, so what am I waiting for? It's got to be here. And of course it's quite easy to find once you know it's got to be there. By God, GT, and Oxford 17, and I can't tell you how thrilled I was when I saw what was left. Yes, ELARE, which is Earl. It's a very clean, very tidy, everything's used. These sonnets by God and Oxford the 17th Earl I'd found the 3rd time, and I can tell you there was a lot of Menorcan wine was drunk that night, but it wasn't till several months later, and I was contemplating this even deeper and realized the significance of the 4th T, and that everything to do with Vere, specifically to do with Vere, seemed to be endorsed not 3 times but 4 times. It's back to this idea that he's the 4th T within the Triple Tower. So, for instance, where we learn that Edward de Vere is 1740, we learn that 4 times. Where we learn that De Vere is the 4th T, this is encrypted, not 3, but 4 times. So if we're learning that Edward de Vere is the poet, even if it's with God, we have to have it 4 times. I can tell you that was a sweaty, tense moment when I thought we'd got to find it again, but I think I've succeeded. Why am I showing you 2 V's? Okay, in 1589, Edward de Vere's secretary and servant, who was helping him to write a lot of propaganda pamphlets, along with other servants of his called Thomas Nash and Robert Greene, Anthony Mundy, called John Lilly. John Lilly published this pamphlet in which the prefatory letter is signed by an anonymous person calling himself Double V. Now, Double V, as you probably know in French, double V means a W, double V. And it is thought by many people that Double V is none other than Edward de Vere. In fact, Double V comes under attack from Gabriel Harvey in 1593 in a work called Pierce's Supererogation, and there are clues in that Double V is indeed Edward de Vere. a very brilliant Oxfordian scholar called William Ray is very convinced that double V is a sort of moniker for Edward de Vere, and points to various places, including, for instance, the title pages of some of the Shakespeare quartos. The tragedy of Othello, for instance, here, written by double V. If you actually look at that closely, you see the V's aren't even touching. They're pretending, obviously, to be the W, the W of William Shakespeare, but it's giving you the idea of de Vere, the two V's, de Vere. Now, if you look at Edward de Vere's coat of arms, you see that his motto, Vere nihil verius, has two very prominent V's. De Vere. In fact, what you've actually got there is two Veres. De Vere. De Vere. So, I think that was the reason why Edward de Vere was using double V as a sort of pseudonym, moniker, if you like. So, vero nihil verius, what does this mean? Well, actually it means two things. Deliberately means two things. It means nothing truer than truth. Well, obviously there's nothing truer than truth, but of course truth is God. As Jesus says, ego sum veritas, I am the truth, God is truth. So vero nihil verius can mean nothing truer than God. It also means nothing truer than Vere. And this is back to what we've been looking at time and time again, is Vere, nothing truer than Vere by the grace of God within him. It's back to this whole idea that we have free will, and yet what we do is done by the grace of God. And this is one of the founding theology of Bernard of Clairvaux and the Knights Templars, and of course is picked up by some of these Masons, and is now showing his key to the Royal Archmasonry. So nothing truer than Vere by the grace of God within him. So we know, as we've seen 3 times, the poems are by God and Vere, the poet. Therefore is represented by the double V, de Vere, and G, God. God and de Vere, we've seen it 3 times. And God, of course, is represented by the big G. We've seen it all the time in Freemasonry and on the title page of the sonnets. So what is this that I'm showing you, this God and de Vere, the poet, vero nihil verius? Well, you may have guessed it's an anagram. Let's start working it out. You can see if I pick out those letters there, we have our ever-living poet. And what do you think then is left above? I don't know if you can see it. Well, it is an anagram of wisheth. We have our ever-living poet wisheth. And where did we see that? Yes, it's the very central triangle of the triple towers, the 4th T there. An Oxfordian scholar called Jonathan Bond was the one who tried to show that vero nihil verius was hidden in our ever-living poet, but he couldn't quite work it all out because of these tag ends and bits like the double V and G. But now we've got this into focus, the idea that de Vere is double V, God is G, de Vere God, that's the moniker, the poet. Nothing truer than Vere by the grace of God within him. So, if anyone asks you, 3 times 3 equals 9, I think you should answer just as Costard did in Love's Labour's Lost. Not so, sir. We know what we know. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed that, and do subscribe. I'll try and put new ideas down every now and then.